was El Cajon in the late 1880s. El Cajon today. What a difference 100 years makes. Hello, I'm Eldonna Lay, author of The Valley of Opportunity, The History of El Cajon. And the history of El Cajon is really the history of America. Its educational systems, its banking systems, its society. Mainly, it's the history of families.
Welcome to the Vasher Ranch, which has been the Vasher Ranch since about 1888 or 89, when my father bought this property after leaving Philadelphia. Originally, the ranch consisted of some 65 acres of ground, which he developed into a citrus orchard and a grape vineyard.
We came out here in '98 from Ohio on the train, and we arrived in Los Angeles, and people there tried to make us stay there in Los Angeles. Said, this is as far as the train goes, and Dad said, no, we're bound for San Diego. So we got on a little train that came to San Diego, came to El Cajon, up, well, I guess the train still runs up there. And so we got off of the train there in El Cajon, and some people from the station there brought us up to the ranch. We didn't have any way to get here, so they left us up here. And I know Mother said, when we arrived here, Mother said, well, this is certainly the end of the world.
Many of the people who came to the valley were people with college educations, while many of them, such as my father, had only 8th grade educations. And so it was quite a mix of people, but they seemed to have a common interest and all be interested in cultural, or many of them interested in cultural things. It's a different picture than people often have, I think, of what rural life was like in those early days of the late 18th and or late 19th and early 20th century. My mother's family, my grandfather, her father, had come from Sweden to fight in the Civil War, and as to replace someone who had been drafted or conscripted, as they called it then, I think. He came at age 16 and fought in the Civil War and used the money he was paid to attend Knox College in Illinois and graduate from it, and there he met my grandmother, who was the daughter of Swedish immigrants, and her father was a jeweler in Illinois. He went on to be a very successful businessman in Chicago. They lived in Evanston, and unfortunately became ill. And so my grandmother, with 7 children and an invalid husband, was advised that his health would probably be better in California, and brought the whole family out here. My 2 oldest uncles were at that time enrolled in Northwestern University and had to leave school. My mother had graduated from the academy at Northwestern, which was the high school there, and was attending the Art Institute of Chicago. And I've often wondered what their feelings were, having their whole life at that time so drastically changed to come to a small community in Southern California. My grandmother purchased the old Bostonian store, and my 2 elder uncles ran that store for a number of years.
three brothers, and they had a T in their name. And they got in a fight, the story is, with their father, so they all left. Three of them left, took the T out of the name, and came here. Well, my grandfather went to a missionary school, a theological school, and graduated and became a reverend minister. And the other two apparently went into the glass business. The Thatcher Glass is very famous back in Needham. They have a big factory back there.
In Massachusetts.
In Needham, Massachusetts. And my daughter-in-law and son were there last summer, and they went through this museum, and they took several pictures of their cut glass they were quite famous for.
My father came to San Diego, no, to America about 1906, and later my mother came about 1913. Some of the men folks were looking for work in San Diego, and so they walked from Los Angeles. It took over a day, I'm sure.
The reason we came to San Diego was because the folks had this property down here, and they wanted to do something with it. During the earthquake, my father was down here, but I can remember living in Oakland across the bay from San Francisco, and my mother putting the blankets over us boys so that the plaster and the bricks wouldn't hurt us. And we also had to live outside for 6 months, and we made a bread out there on a gas stove, and we called it earthquake bread. And it was good too, believe me. When school was out in June, we came down here, and we moved right into the old ranch. And El Cajon was the first place that we hit, and I met my first El Cajon person in El Cajon. And it was Ambrosio Ruiz. He was marshal of the town at the time, of about 700 people.
The family we have 6 generations that's still alive in the Rios family. My great-grandfather on the Rios side was constable for Julian. And I have a son now that's in the detectives of the El Cajon police. My grandfather was the foreman for the water district, and my father was a walker for the water district, the flumes. I used to walk the flumes.
Bonnie, you know, back in about 1904, 5 to 7, 8, when I lived down here at the old Villa Carroll Ranch, just off of Chase on Pine Avenue, this road going through the Gross Mount Summit was only a 40-foot easement, but there was only a 20-foot wide road, dirt road. It was so narrow that when we drive out from San Diego with a horse and buggy, we could hardly pass the other trucks and vehicles going the other direction. And it's hard to believe, you know, back in those days, my dad would come home from town on Saturdays, and he'd bring a box of 100 eucalyptus trees. And he and I would go out, and you see all those big old eucalyptus trees down there. My dad and I planted all those way back in the early days. It was about 1905, 6, 7, 8 long in there. But you see, in those days, the easement for roads was only 40 feet wide. And each time that the highway widened, they'd take off some more of our property on both sides. So pretty soon we had no lots left to sell.
You're kidding?
Yeah, no, I'm not kidding.
You can do that? That's legal?
Well, yeah, it's the right of eminent domain. The state of California and the county could do what they wanted. But that's the situation, the way it was back in those early days.
Neighbors, one on one side quite a little ways, and a neighbor on this side. But it was beautiful here. I thought it was beautiful. It was orange orchards, and everything was well kept. And it was just awfully pretty country. Could really see the hills. And so it was quite a while before we had electricity into the house. And also, we didn't have telephones either in that time. But we didn't know any better. We were just like everybody else who was here, you know. It was just the same. So So we just got used to all the new things that came along. As long as electricity came along, they had to put the poles in, you know, for electricity. So when that came in, when it passed the place, well, then we had electricity. So things just came to us one by one that way. The telephone finally got to us too. So.
There was no water in the first house that we had here. There was water in the tank for the grove and a cold water tap in the kitchen. We lived in what would be considered today primitive conditions. Outside privy, the bathroom had was the kitchen with a little round tub that was brought in and filled with water. Cooking was done on a kerosene stove. Heating was done with a kerosene heater or a wood stove. Then later in the 30s, when we got the home loan improvement loans from the federal government, we added a practical bathroom and a practical kitchen with electric range and refrigerator. Up until 1930-some, we never had a practical bathroom or a practical refrigerator or an electric stove.
Yeah, Mother had, she could milk the cows, and she had chickens, lots of chickens she took care of. And on the upper part of the place, Dad raised hay. There wasn't anything on it when we first came here, so Dad had planted the oats, and we had good hay crop, and Mother would help Dad. He'd haul the hay in, and Mother would get up on the haystack and help fix the hay so it would make a nice haystack. Yeah, and Mother had chickens, lots of chickens that she cared for, and then she had a garden. I said she was really a wonderful woman.
At the time I grew up here, it was a very fortunate place for a child to be. Children then had a lot more freedom, I believe, than they have today. We knew each other well, the small group of us who lived right downtown in El Cajon, and we had a lot of freedom to play in our large yards, climb trees, explore all kinds of things. Of course, we did have to watch for dangers that are found only in the outskirts of the valley these days, rattlesnakes and various kinds of things such as horses that had gotten loose and other farm animals. But fast-moving cars, heavy traffic, dangers from strangers didn't enter into our lives at all. I think we perhaps grew up with more confidence in ourselves and our surroundings, our whole environment, than people do today, children and older young people too. They always have to be watching out and questioning things, and in general, our environment was a secure one. As I said, the town was small, and I suppose there were, 15 or 20 children of varying ages with whom we played. Among them were the W.D. Hall family, and we used to love to go down there, and there was a bridge across Main Street, and in the summertime it was cool to play under that bridge. And we invented all kinds of games. There was sand there, and you could play in the sand. And sometimes we played games in which the boys battled the girls and threw sand at each other and various things of that kind. Our parents probably didn't approve of the mess we made of our clothes. But it really was a very good environment in which to grow up.
Just over the hill, which you can't see for the shrubbery, was an Indian encampment. Two huts. As I remember them, they were simply looked like rough tar paper sheds with brush and palm leaves pushed over them. They did their cooking outdoors. There was a little spring where they were. And the old chief used to work for my father and work for our neighbor, Mr. Parsons. And the old squaw would come over and visit with my mother every once in a while. They couldn't communicate except by hand signals, and that's about all. The encampment was halfway between where we are now and Hamishaw Road. At one occasion, and when I was in the 5th grade, I used to go to school in the Hillsdale School, and I walked right by the encampment, right by where is now the quarry, to the Hillsdale School. One-room school. Miss Chase was our teacher. And then the following year, of course, the consolidation of the Cajon Valley District took place, and I finished up my school in El Cajon.
You know, Bonnie, as my number 2 granddaughter, I thought it'd be a good idea to come down and show you where I used to live back in 1956 to 1908. There used to be a beautiful old home there, right where the new home has been built. This was all called the Villa Carroll Ranch. And when my dad and Bill Gross bought the property in 1904, I think it was, there was only about 40 acres of citrus all around the ranch here, and the people that owned it, they didn't want all these rough hills behind because they were too rough to do anything with, so they threw them all in, about 200 acres. And my dad subdivided it into gross mounds.
Wow.
And some of these big pine trees here were there, only smaller when I was a kid. And back up their ways, there are a couple of cork oak trees that were brought around the Horn from Portugal by the original owner of this property.
Wow.
Dr. Yeskus owns the property today, I'm sure. He bought it from the estate of Art Gaines, and it's really, he's kept it up in great shape.
That's beautiful.
Isn't it a beautiful spot?
Mm-hmm.
I just thought you'd like to know where your old grandfather used to live.
Yeah. Now, when you were here, there was a different house up there, and you had barns and...
Yeah, there was a big barn over there and a big wooden house, but it burnt down.
How did it burn down? One of your kids playing?
No, this was after we traded the house and about 10 or 12 acres to the mayor of San Diego, a fellow by the name of Wadham, and for his home, which was on the corner of 8th and Ash Street in San Diego.
Downtown?
It was right up there opposite the El Cortez Hotel, right on what they call, well, in those days it was right across the street from U.S. Grant's home.
Oh.
U.S. Grant.
Is there anything left of it now?
No, it was all torn down and the El Cortez Hotel was built. And there's nothing left of our old home. It was torn down and apartments built there. But we moved out from this house into the 810 Ash Street house in 1908.
Tie the horses to the hitching post down in El Cajon. Well, there was this Rumsey store. Mr. Rumsey had a store, and then there was a Mr. Stale, William Stale. There were some Stale boys here that lived out towards Dehesa there. So they had a grocery store and kind of a department store on where Elms are now. And that's what we had. Then we had a drugstore and a blacksmith shop and that place where, see, who is it? It's on the corner there, on the corner of Prescott and Main Street. That old building was there when we came here. I guess that's the only one that was left there. Yeah. But they had a drugstore and a blacksmith shop and grocery store. And there was the Knowles. They were quite prominent people in El Cajon. She had a hotel, I think, and a eating house and a place. And the old bank there, though, the corner in the bank, what used to be the Quebec Bank, has been there for years and years. I don't know what they used it for, but no, when they built that, we thought they were really getting real cityfied, you know, El Cajon. Well, we've enjoyed the history of El Cajon for a long time, you know. It's kind of fun. But all these places around down here on Hamishaw, where Isn't it just really, you know, it's just going to be houses and people and automobiles. It's just awful. Well, I often think if Dad and Mother were here, I don't know what they'd think, I guess.
My grandfather, in 1898, bought the ranch, 525 acres, and built apparently the home was already there in the barn. And he sold it in 1925, and it burned shortly afterwards. The barn, you see, is still standing. The surrounding ranches were the olive people, the Gifford Olives, and they would, up the river, the Sweetwater River, the Weddles and the Allens and Schobergs. Well, my grandfather sold the ranch in 1926, and at that time he was living in La Mesa. The house burned shortly afterwards, and the barn is still standing. Well, during the 1900, my father went to San Diego High School, that is the old Russ School, and then he went to Berkeley for a law degree and graduated in 1908. And he lived here till about 1912 or 13 and married my mother in 1913.
The ivy, which is draping on the two near elm trees, that ivy came from my grandfather's place in El Cajon. The Asher family owned 40 acres right where Sears and Parkway Plaza is now. My grandfather was quite a nurseryman and gardener, and he, in communication with people all over the world, would bring exotic plants and strange things to this area and try to grow them in El Cajon. Among the things that he got was an ivy, which grew over the old ranch house in El Cajon. Later, it grew over the high school, and eventually I got starts from the high school to bring it out here. Now, that ivy came from Washington Irving's home in New York. And Washington Irving had gotten that ivy from Sir Walter Scott's home in Scotland. So we're quite proud of trying to keep that ivy strain growing. In front of that are violets, and the violets come from Canada. My mother brought them up from El Cajon. Her mother brought them to El Cajon from San Diego, and before that from San Francisco. And her mother had brought them from Toronto, Canada to San Francisco. And my mother was very, very strong on holding that strain of violets because it had family ties. And I've tried to keep it going too. Around the 50s, my mother's brother, Robert Asher, came to live on the place with her. He had been the hermit of Palomar Mountain. He was an artist, he was a naturalist, he was a collector of stamps and Indian arrowheads. He was a loner and had proved up on a homestead on top of Palomar, and had also had some federal land across the border, a couple of 40-acre plots, where the observatory on Mount Palomar is now. As he grew old and unable to live his life as a hermit on Palomar Mountain, or going down to San Ysidro and growing his ferns in a half-acre lath house that he had in San Ysidro, he finally came to live with my mother. But he did not want to live in a house. He was an outdoor person, and so he put up a tent. That tent was right in that circle of trees by the olive tree and the other trees that are there, and he lived there until he passed away in the 50s.
Well, to return to El Cajon and the childhood there, Main Street was full of interesting things. There was the fire alarm, which was a big iron tie from a railroad train that hung just across the street from our house. And of course there was a volunteer fire company, and any time there was a fire, all the children eagerly ran to see the firemen get out and get ready to go out on duty. One of the hazards, of course, in those early days were the grass fires in the summertime along a hillside. And I can remember the men coming in, the women would take food up to them when they were fighting the grass fires, food and water for drinking and so forth. But then they would come home and they'd be, some of them with slight burns, and they were covered with cinders and blackened faces from the smoke. But those fires just raced like mad. And it was something that people really feared during the summer months, and fall particularly when the east winds were blowing, because they were much more hazardous when there was a strong wind. We have much less of that nearby these days, but we have many more fires in the mountains than we had, because the more people around, the more opportunities there are for those to occur.
How much and how little things have changed. And it's the process of change that must be recorded so that our children and our children's children will better understand who and what they are.
One thing I'd like to impress upon whoever watching today, especially the young people, be sure before it's too late to interview, interrogate, question your parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, if possible, about dates when they came here and where they were and this and that, and any photographs, because I didn't do it. And I had a big fire in 1970, and that wiped out all our photos practically, so I don't have any record really before 1970, except a few isolated photographs that escaped. Now everything has changed. All you see is subdivision stakes and flags.
It seems to have happened overnight, those irreplaceable memories of events and traditions that must be preserved.